Welcome to Healing the Spirit, a space where we awaken our creativity, deepen our connections, and remember who we are through the lens of astrology, archetypes, and art making. I'm your host, Jonathan Coe. Hello everyone, welcome to Healing the Spirit and welcome to this episode. So in this episode, I will be sharing with you some of my contemplations for the coming week of June 19th, 2023. And as always, my invitation is for you to allow yourself to tune inwards and to really feel into what is moving through you, what is moving through your body, through your mind, through your spirit, and through your emotions as you are listening to this, because chances are those are precisely what you need to be working with. And so, an invitation for you to allow these contemplations to not be teachings per se, but to be a mirror into which you gaze upon your own reality. Okay, so I, as always, would like to begin with a little bit of a rundown of the astrology of the coming week. On Monday, the 19th, we have Jupiter in Taurus sextiling Saturn in Pisces. On Wednesday, the 21st, we have the solstice. It's the summer solstice for those of us on the northern part of the hemisphere, and winter solstice for the southern part of the hemisphere. And the sun will enter Cancer. Mercury in Gemini will sextile Mars in Leo. And then on Friday, the 23rd, the sun in Cancer will sextile the North Node in Taurus. And then on Sunday, the 25th, Mercury in Gemini will square Neptune in Pisces. And so what I think is quite interesting about this particular week is that energetically, I feel like there's a constant sense of readjustment. And it's not so much about arriving, I think, but it's really about figuring out what it means to be flexible enough to kind of try out and inhabit all the different options. So last week, we spoke about the mutability of this astrological weather that we currently have. If we look at this week and we look at the 6 traditional planets this week, minus the moon, because the moon is always moving, right? We can see that using traditional rulership, all of the planets from this week eventually answer to Mercury in Gemini. Mercury is at home in Gemini, and Mercury brings surprises, right? Mercury brings options. Mercury brings flexibility. Meanwhile, we also have the sun moving into Cancer. And in Cancer, right, the sun is then going to be ruled by the moon. So we have this really interesting situation of the luminary kind of answering to one another, right? While the sun is in Cancer, the sun and the moon have this really deep relationship. They're in a constant dance with one another. And to me, right, the moon rules the body, it rules incarnation, form, it rules the emotional realm. And so we're also moving into territories where the emotional body can really show us what our next steps are, especially if we listen deeply. Listening to our emotional body, to the up and down waves, right, of our emotional responses, our emotional reactions, can take a lot of training. It can take a lot of practice, patience, and maturity, right? It takes a lot of willingness to be with what can feel like this ever-shifting tide, right, of emotions. But the reality is that it also gives us real pointers, right, if we wait it out, around where in our lives and in our realities can we bring in more friendliness, more care, more kindness, right? So let's put the two together. Let's put Mercury and the moon together, right? This week, I think there's a lot of potential for tweaks on a mundane, physical, relational, spiritual level in favor of prioritizing our emotional well-being, right? And so The word that I am contemplating for this week, and that I'm also inviting you into deeper contemplation and deeper relating with, is this idea of emotional liberation. What does this word, emotional liberation, mean for you? What does it look like for you specifically, as the human that you are, to feel emotional liberation, to feel that you are emotionally liberated? What do you perceive to be the main limitation, the main blockage to your emotional liberation? And maybe also consider, when was the last time you experienced emotional liberation? Notice what gets stirred up within you. If nothing gets stirred up and you feel this kind of blankness, that's also important to notice, right? That's also information. And you can kind of sit with it, sit with that blankness, and ask that blankness what it's trying to tell you. What I think is important to mention is that emotional liberation is not the same for everyone, right? And therefore, your specific flavor of emotional liberation matters. The more you're able to affirm, the more you're able to appreciate the particular flavor of emotional liberation that your system is kind of craving for, your system is kind of looking for in this moment, the more you're able to really create this reality where that emotional liberation has a pathway to become possibilities, to become part of your reality, right? A simple example is, for some people, emotional liberation may feel like being surrounded by your human friends all the time, like being able to have access to people on your speed dial that you can kind of talk to all the time, right? For others, emotional liberation looks like the opposite, looks like having a lot of space to sit with your own thoughts, to simply be outside, to be in a crowded intersection, and watch the traffic of humans and maybe not even have to say a word, right? So, another example is emotional liberation may feel to you like having a schedule that looks completely empty, like not really scheduling anything, right? Allowing your body to kind of move at the whim of its impulses. For others, that may feel completely blocking, right? Or what's the word I'm looking for? It may feel like it's completely blocking the access that you have to creativity, that maybe you need a little bit of structure, right? That you need a little bit of extra scaffolding so that within your day you can feel like you can just flow, right? And you can change your plans maybe, but you have some sort of template. So oftentimes, right, what we need as social beings, as beings that are entangled with other beings in this reality, is related to others. What we need is some sort of nourishment that can only be experienced in connection to, in relation to another being, right? And so the distinction between individualism and the idea of the self as the mirror to the rest of the world, to me, this is really important to contemplate, right? We are constantly, there's no way that we can really escape this reality where we coexist with other people, right? And also at the same time, we don't always all have the same reality. Like, I'm always struck living in a city like New York that I could be sitting next to the subway or next to someone on the bus, right? Next to someone that I have no idea how their reality looks like. And it can look very similar to mine. It can look very different to mine, but ultimately it is very different, right? And so your experience as a singular being doesn't represent the totality of reality, right? However, it does represent a fraction, and that fraction makes up the whole. So if you allow yourself to be curious about your own individual experience, often what's on the other end of it is you get access to more of the big picture, right? I think there's a difference between kind of getting stuck in our own experience versus being able to affirm our experience and then kind of use that experience, right, to become this portal through which you see the larger experience. So what I've noticed in my own personal and professional practice is that we move through cycles around this, right? I would say that maybe for me, at least as a conceptual framework, the starting point is that maybe not even noticing our own particularity, right? Not even noticing that our brand of expressing, of experiencing our desires are unique to us, right? And then when we start noticing whatever it is that catalyzed that noticing, right, there can be this split experience. On the one hand, we can feel the deliciousness of our specificity, right? On the other hand, we may also feel this wave of grief that maybe we haven't fully allowed ourselves to be exactly who we are. Perhaps due to our conditioning or due to the way our society has crystallized around certain ways of being, right? That we may feel like these unique ways that are truly ours have no space within the society or the system we find ourselves in. And then the next stage is that often for a lot of us, we become a little bit defiant, right? In order to assert ourselves and how we want to do things and how we want to live our reality, often we kind of start to make ourselves known, right? We start to allow our environment to smell the true smell of who we are, right? Kind of like a kid who suddenly realized that they can do something by themselves. Like, I don't know if you've noticed this, but I've noticed that there are certain kids for whom once they learn how to tie their shoes, for example, they never want anybody else to tie their shoes, right? Or once they learn to, do a certain task, right? Like maybe do a certain kind of, math operations that they're learning. They don't want other people to tell them, oh, look, there's maybe a different way or a better way, right? It feels like invasive to them. It feels repulsive for them to notice how other people are doing things because they just don't want to, right? We become, I think at this stage, we can become pretty allergic to anything that we perceive doesn't really fit within the box of this new self-realization, right? Most people, I think, gets really stuck in this stage. We start to put ourselves into this box of, this is who I am, this is how I do things, and we stop being curious about the rest of the world. And to me, this boxing in can be quite dangerous, right? This is where we start to treat any sort of divergent perspectives as a wrong thing. We start to treat difference as a threat to the validity of our way of being, right? I think that you can really probably see this if you are aware of the collective trends of how much our collective way of thinking is based on this idea that sameness is equal to security, right? And while I don't think this is true, I think it does make sense because we haven't really seen modeled for us this way of being where there can be differences, there can be variety, and in the variety, we experience aliveness. We experience the deepening of the richness of life, right? We don't always see a lot of examples around that. So we immediately consider that differences are scary, right? Differences are dangerous to us. When we are stuck in this part of the cycle, we start noticing, I think, in my own experience and the experiences of people I talk to, we start noticing that our circles begin to close in, right? Maybe the number of people we can have meaningful, trust-based connections with begin to start shrinking. Or maybe we notice that we start to be unable to see other people's perspectives from our from their positionality, right? We consistently interpret other people's behaviors based on our cosmology, right? We're not able to see why people do certain things, right? Which to me is very different than condoning, right? Condoning is one thing, but I think being able to see why people do certain things and being able to at least mentally have perspectives around why people are the way they are is a gift, right? That we all can kind of cultivate, Perhaps we have different ability, right? We have different limits to how open we can be around this. And I don't think that it's a judgment, right? I don't think there's judgment around not being able to be quote unquote open enough. However, I think for many of us, we really, looking at the state of the collective, we really would benefit from being able to at least see, right, why people do the things they do. Or at least have some sort of understanding on a deeper emotional level. This is, I think, a stage where it can feel like our specificity, our uniqueness is always in contrast or always at war against other people's uniqueness, right? It's interesting because I think that this is also where a lot of stories around like the hero's journey, which I think is so valuable for many of us, right? To have that template in the collective, can swing the other direction, right? Like the pendulum can kind of swing a little too far because we get so obsessed by this idea that we are the singular hero trying to take down, like we're this David trying to take down this Goliath, right? We just kind of want to shut down and push away the reality that we are all a little bit different. And maybe there's some part of us that that doesn't make sense to other people. That there are some parts of other people that don't make sense to us. And yet that inability, right, to inhabit another person's experience is not really a detriment to connection. It's not really a blockage to experiencing love and admiration and collaboration, right? To me, this place in my own system feels like emotional constipation. This to me is where self-discovery turns into navel gazing, right? So I want to talk about the next stage. I want to talk about what is possible if we allow ourselves to move through the stage, right? I think if we allow the discomfort of that stuckness, of being comfortable to really speak to us, to really have a dialogue with it, we can drop into a deeper spiral of wisdom. This is the space where we get to affirm, where we get to enjoy the specificity of who we are, right? While also appreciating the fact that out there, other people have their own perspectives and processes, right? Some traditions call the stage non-attachment. Other traditions call it neutrality, right? I have a different perspective on this. I have a different term for this. I call this participation. I call this engagement, right? When we talk about truly engaging with our reality, to me, the fullest expression of that engagement, right, has to do with simultaneously holding the both and, right? Really loving the neither nor, and also still operating from a perspective of really knowing our specific placement within that greater web of life, right? The two are actually not separate from one another. The more you can see the bigger picture, the more you can appreciate the bigger picture, the more you can sense the entanglement, the deeper you can be in affirming what's yours and what's not really yours, and therefore you can trust that that greater web of life can hold you, right, in the process of letting that be out in the world. There is liminality here. There's queerness here, right, in this kind of perspective, because it's not about choosing the lane of being yourself at the expense of participating in the greater web of life, right? To me, participating in the greater web of life looks like looking at that web of life and also doing your specific part within that greater web of life, right? Most importantly, I think there's translucence. Because in gazing into our own reflection, we get to also know the collective, right? The universe is fractal. The universe is created of little parts that actually constitute the whole, but even if you zoom into the little parts, often you can see a reflection or some sort of semblance of the whole within that part, right? So if we maintain commitment to really participating, rather than being stuck in a trance of our own reflection, we can deeply engage, deeply participate, right? And on some sense, it looks like non-attachment, but I think it's like, if we just think about non-attachment, to me, this is not enough, right? Because for many of us, we actually get the satisfaction, we actually get the recognition, we get the surprises, right? We get the peace that comes from really deepening into participating with life, even though sometimes that participation may look like actively waiting, right? It's kind of like the difference, I think, when I've been looking at different mythologies and story and fairy tales as of late, and it's making me think about the act of falling down that happens with Narcissus, right, who drowned because they were too enamored by their own reflection on the surface of the lake, right, versus Alice, falling down the rabbit hole, which led her to a whole adventure, right? And there's no morality here, because in reality, Narcissus also became a flower, right, which is another kind of adventure, but I think it's really fascinating to think about the evolution of what it can look like if we are not just stuck in trying to maintain the validity of our perspective, but rather we start recognizing that just by the fact that we have those perspectives, that we have those preferences, inherently it already means that those perspectives are valid, right? And this idea of needing to prove whether something is valid or not is so interesting, because I think the existence of something is the evidence, the most powerful, the most, the deepest evidence that something is valid. It's already here. You don't need to question the validity of it because it's here, So how do we do this? I think there are many potential answers, right? But when I look back at my life, I see kind of a unique pattern and a correlation between the times that I got stuck in kind of navel gazing or stuck in trying to defend my perspective, right? That I start to lose sense of the greater perspective. To me, it often has to do with not feeling safe enough in my system to affirm my own perspective. It's interesting because on the outside, this feels a little counterintuitive, right? We live in a culture where we see people who exhibit certain qualities that to our perspective may seem self-absorbed, and it's really easy to label that they are narcissists. However, what I see is rather different, actually. What I see is that when people hang on to dear lives, they hang on so tightly to their perspectives, to their way of looking at the world, their way of being. When someone, or maybe even ourselves, when we're so stuck in our own way of looking at the world, often it's because we're feeling unsafe about exploring new ways of seeing, of being with ourselves and the world, right? And again, to me, this all leads back to the idea of emotional liberation, right? When we give ourselves the chance to be nourished, to feel safe within our own body, within our own experience, right? We have deeper access to emotional liberation, however that looks like for us, right? Because we resource ourselves, and through that resourcing, we have more flexibility. And so, how do we create a deeper sense of safety, a deeper sense of security, of belonging through our mundane reality? This is my invitation to you. I invite you to consider a couple things. One, that emotional liberation often also comes from liberating the body, right? In ancient astrology, the moon speaks to, yes, our emotional realm, but also our body, right? Our soma, our incarnational plane. And I love contemplating this because the division between the emotional and the soma, or the incarnational, is probably relatively new, right? It's an idea that I think is popularized by mainstream psychology. And we also really begin to see it melting away nowadays with the rise of people seeking guidance, seeking facilitation to kind of come back to the body, right? To work within the body itself, to not stow away the body in some closet, right? While we work on our mindset or our way of thinking. So the moon is kind of teaching us that, hey, emotional liberation is deeply entangled with physical liberation too. It's not just in the mind, right? What's only in the mind will probably not work. The second invitation that I have for you is to consider the planets that are creating sextile aspects this week as your guidance, right? So let's begin with Jupiter sextiling Saturn, right? When we look at the nature of Jupiter and Saturn, we can ask questions like, what limitations are necessary to experience true nourishment and regenerative overflow for me? What abundance is necessary to experience solidity and security? What boundaries do you need to communicate or simply to affirm to yourself, right, in order to relate more deeply? Oftentimes, we think of boundaries as separate from our ability to connect deeply, right? It's almost like boundaries create separation. But sometimes that separation is exactly what we need in order to have deeper, more meaningful relationship. Because sometimes having a little bit of that space gives us the resourcing necessary to feel safe in that experience, right? And when we feel safe, we can relate more deeply. What resources do you need more of so that you can more clearly see the solidity and the validity of your being, of your existence? So that's Jupiter sextile Saturn. With Mercury sextiling Mars, we can think about what are some of the pathways necessary for us to express freely with minimal restrictions, right? How can you facilitate more immediate access to your own life force energy? By pathway, what I mean is that Mercury creates paths, right? Mercury creates bridges. Sometimes Mercury even creates routine. A very mundane example that I can kind of give you from my own life is that I found that sticking to some version of movement practice, whether that be running outside, right, or dancing, right under the moonlight or whatever that is, right, really helps me feel more of my own life force. I've even noticed, in situations like, for example, being in Zoom meetings, it's really helpful for me to allow my hands to actually move with me because there is expression, right? There's energy that wants to be expressed through my body. That's not just through my voice. That's not just through my face, right? What does it look like to give myself more of the fullness of expression that I can experience, right, for myself and for others? Often there's discomfort for me around this because sometimes I would rather not be in a body, right? I would rather not be with the trouble that comes from my physical form's limitations. But also, I think if that's part of your experience, what I always come back to and I would like to offer up to you in case this is helpful, is realizing that this body is in some ways all I have, right? It's what I have. It's my primary tool to translate dreams, to translate visions into reality. Maybe my only tool, right? In that case. My body, my own life, my own experience is so crucial to me being able to truly experience things, right? So how do I really honor it? By coming back to it. And then when we look at the sun sextiling the north node, right? The question to contemplate is, what do you need to see? What do you need to illuminate in order to experience your aliveness, in order to experience your incarnate experience more fully? How can we more deeply understand our ability to shine through considering what it means to navigate the path of being alive, right? The sun, to me, is an ally to affirming our experiences, right? One of my favorite ways to work with the sun is with a very simple question from one of my most important teachers, Deborah Kremens. And that question is, what do I need to know about whatever situation it is, right? Literally, asking like, what do I need to know about my romantic relationships at this moment? Or what do I need to know about my offerings, right? And then really listening deeply for the answers, even if no answers come up, or maybe there are answers that come up that are conflicting, right? But this question is such a powerful pathway into which you can begin to look at your own spiritual mirror, so to speak. It's really wild to me how helpful this very simple practice can be, right? And to me, the wording is really important because this idea of what do I need to know gives simultaneously an opening and a limiting, right? It's about being on a need to know basis, right? I don't know if any of you have are familiar with that term, but sometimes, if you work in an organization, it's really important for you to ask questions like, what do I need to know, right? Because sometimes there are a lot of informations, there's a lot of personnel, everybody's doing different things. So this question of asking this inquiry of what do I need to know is really helpful because it kind of narrows it down, right? And at the same time, it's also open enough. So I think in the metaphor of our own lives, that's also true, right? And you can even place that question temporally. You can really anchor that question in the present moment. What do I need to know in the present moment about XYZ, right? The final thing I will say in this contemplation is that Mercury is also squaring Neptune this week. So the way that I'm thinking about that is what may show up is that you might find that your reality, the way you've been organizing your mundane existence, isn't quite aligned with the deeper, the dreamier, the more authentic visions, right? In other words, you may be more aware of reality not aligning with the dreams. And I think this is a place where a lot of grief can really come, right? A lot of confusion can really be present for us. And so my invitation is to actually see this as the places where there are potentials for practicing compassion, right? Really deeply, truly looking at this reality with a little bit of compassion. What does it mean to give yourself the medicine of seeing where things need to change, and also at the same time not beating yourself up about how that change can kind of take effect, right? How quickly it can happen. Where is the middle ground? What exists in that space between you recognizing something needs to change and you actually changing the thing, right? Sometimes that space is very narrow for us. Other times we need more spaciousness, right? We need to ask for guidance from our reality, from our dream world, from the guidance, right, of the human and the non-human world that's always around us. So that's it that I have for you with regards to contemplations this week. I hope that this has been helpful. I hope that it gives you some pointers around what it is that you need to be working with. A couple things I want to announce. The first one is I would like to invite you to check the work of my friends at Open. Open is a meditation app. It's a breathwork app. There's also movements, practices, and videos there that are so helpful. And I think especially with a week like this one, tapping into the work of meditating or doing breath work or doing movement practices can be really helpful, because it gives you a little bit of space from your default way of being with your reality, right? So if that feels really supportive, I have a code that you can use where you can try Open for 30 days for free, and it's all in the show notes, and I would highly encourage you to check that out. The other announcement that I have is that if you are interested in receiving a reading, I would love to hold space for you to assist you and facilitate your process in getting to know your chart better, or to get guidance from the Akashic Records. And so reach out to me if that feels resonant for you at this time. All right. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you. I appreciate your time, your attention, and your energy. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm sending you lots of love. And I can't wait until we gather again in this format. Take care.